My name is Grace Miller. I was 36 when I walked out of the glass lobby of Harrington and Vale with a cardboard box under my arm and a certainty that the world had narrowed to the size of the street beneath my feet. I had been at Harrington and Vale for 9 years. I had joined as a junior account manager right after law school, though I had quickly discovered that my heart belonged less to statutes and more to people and ideas. The firm had a marketing division that handled luxury brands and tech startups. I moved through it like someone learning the contours of a maze, and then, eventually, mapping shortcuts. I became the person clients trusted. I remembered birthdays. I showed up in the middle of crises at 2 in the morning. I missed weddings and a handful of funerals because a pitch deck had to be finished or a client needed calm. I took promotions that changed my title and my salary and, for a while, my sleep. I did not expect to be made an example. Elena Harrington was the kind of boss who wore success like perfume. She smelled faintly of citrus and something expensive. Her hair was always sleek. Her voice had the sheen of someone who had spent years learning how to control the room. She ran the firm with an engineer's precision and a socialite's appetite for spectacle. She threw holiday parties with sculpted ice and hired string quartets. People liked being near her. They wanted to be inside the circle. For some, proximity translated into advantage. For others, it was a slow burn that consumed them. I thought I had her loyalty. I believed that because I had made her look brilliant more times than I could count, she would be the one to protect me when a storm came. I was wrong. It began with a single meeting. I heard about it in the stairwell from a junior associate who was trying to be useful and failing at discretion. A client had complained. There were whispers about missed targets. Someone in the firm had found a way to blame our team. I did not know the details yet, only the shape of fear. I remember the sound of the fluorescent lights above the stairwell humming like a nervous insect. I remember the plastic taste of cold coffee on my tongue. The meeting was on a Friday. The conference room looked like a stage. Elena sat at the head of the table, arms folded, a glass of water sweating in front of her. She did not smile when she spoke. She methodically read a list of charges. The words were precise, clinical. She accused me of negligence. She said my attention had slipped. She accused me of betraying the firm's trust. When I asked for examples, she waved her hand and said the evidence spoke for itself. At one point, she told a story in a way meant to humiliate me. She recounted a client event where I had allegedly mishandled a presentation. Her voice made it sound like a performance of incompetence. I felt a heat in my neck and a squeeze behind my eyes. I saw colleagues shift in their chairs, their faces the color of tide pools. When I tried to speak, my manager held up a palm and said this was not the time. I was instructed to gather my belongings from my desk and leave immediately. They gave me a letter marked termination. They were professional about their cruelty, like people who specialize in removing stains. Outside, the Los Angeles sky was too white, a washed canvas that made the buildings around me look like models. The cardboard box under my arm contained a photo of my mother, a stack of notebooks, a small potted succulent I had kept for years because I believed plants were quieter proof that life continued. A security guard opened the elevator for me and nodded as if to say I had done something wrong and he had seen worse. I walked to my car feeling detached, as if observing someone else's sorrow on the television. The days after were surreal. I sat in my apartment and watched the city continue. Cars honked. A dog barked across the alley. People made coffee and took their kids to school. I updated my LinkedIn profile in a daze. Calls came from clients expressing bewilderment, and then, slowly, distancing themselves. The firm sent a press release to a couple of trade publications with a line about restructuring and moving in a new strategic direction. I read those words and felt like I had been erased from a photograph. When the initial shock faded, anger arrived like a slow animal. It did not claw. It computed. I had spent my 30s building relationships that mattered. I had nurtured accounts that now brought in millions to the firm. I knew every brand manager's taste, every client's anniversary, how many seats they preferred at the theater. I had a ledger in my head of favors and late-night rescues. I had a list of clients who trusted me because I had always answered at odd hours and because I had admitted mistakes and fixed them. I felt not only personal injustice, but also a cruelty to the clients who had believed in me. Elena's parting shot had been public. She had made a performance of my dismissal in a way meant to instruct younger employees about loyalty. She had written an internal email with that particular combination of condescension and supposed wisdom. People forwarded it with commentary. Some said nothing. Others posted versions of it on social media, attaching their own notes about what the firm needed. In one piece, I recognized the tone of someone who had been seduced by power. I did not have a plan at first. I had a simmering set of observations and the facts were clear. I knew who came to our firm because of me. I knew which relationships were fragile. I knew which clients were dissatisfied with the way the firm had recently restructured their accounts and which ones had been teetering on the edge of boredom. I knew what they would react to and what they would not. I started by listening. I met people for coffee in places that did not belong to the firm. I made my calls outside business hours so the firm could not intercept them, and so that my presence could not be tied to a desk. I wore neutral clothes and tried to look like any professional in the city. I had nothing to hide except my plan. The word for it was not in my vocabulary. I did not tell myself that I sought payback. I told myself I was reclaiming what had been taken. The first client I approached was a boutique skincare brand called L'Oreal. They had been with Harrington & Vale for 5 years. I had been their account lead for 4. We had launched a campaign that tripled their international web traffic. When Elena announced my removal from the team, L'Oreal sent a polite message of concern and then began to receive proposals from other agencies. I heard the brand manager out over cappuccinos at a cafe in Silver Lake. She spoke with a gentle impatience about the firm's new structure and how the new lead did not understand the nuance of their product. She said that early capital was built on conversations and that the person who sold the brand on those ideas should be the person to keep shaping them. I listened more than I spoke. I did not criticize Elena by name. I asked questions. I reminded the client of a detail we had once laughed about at a focus group. I showed her a notebook where I had sketched strategic options for L'Oreal that I had never had the chance to pitch. I left behind a short deck and a simple line. If you ever want to try something that is true to your brand and not to quarterly metrics, call me. They called in 2 weeks. They said they wanted to test a campaign with a more intimate approach. They wanted to try the idea in my deck. They liked the language and the nuance, and they said they missed the way someone used to answer their midnight emails. That first conversion felt like taking a step through ice water. It was both electric and terrifying. I had to be careful. I had no capital beyond a small savings account and a line of credit I would not have touched if not pressed. I rented a modest office in a converted warehouse in downtown Los Angeles. It was a space with exposed pipes and the smell of fresh paint. I bought a second-hand conference table and a few mismatched chairs. I registered my business under the name Lumen Strategies because I liked the way the name sounded like light without being brash. I hired 2 freelancers and a junior creative director who owed me favors and who wanted a different kind of workplace. My goal was not to build something flashy. I wanted to craft campaigns that clients could feel in their chests. I wanted to run a company where people did not have to stage their humanity to get ahead. I wanted to be quiet and competent because noise belonged to the firm that had dismissed me. Word of mouth is a slow and honest route. People remember how they were treated. When L'Oreal sent their first small campaign live and the metrics showed improvement, other clients noticed. I received an email from a mid-sized tech startup that had been flirting with leaving Harrington & Vale. They asked to meet. They wanted the kind of conversations where someone came prepared and listened first. My roster swelled slowly. I kept the firm from knowing how many I was courting by meeting them in coffee shops and rented conference rooms. I never used Harrington & Vale's proprietary materials. I did not copy their proposals. I used my knowledge of the clients and the city in a way that felt personal and I thought fair. There were moments when my conscience pricked me. I remembered sleepless nights at the old firm, the way I had commiserated with colleagues who had struggled. I remembered mentoring younger women and the small ways we supported each other. I had an image of Elena in a marble building, and I told myself that the person she had tried to humiliate would now simply do the work she had dismissed with a more humane hand. When you are orchestrating a fall, you understand the infrastructure of collapse. You study the points that will snap under pressure. For a company built on reputation and impressive parties, reputation was everything. Clients were not just accounts. They were votive offerings to a brand that depended on being seen. If you took the right clients quietly, you destabilized the narrative that the firm was indispensable. Numbers matter, and so does the rumor of numbers. You can have both if you move methodically. What surprised me most was how often the seeds of departure had already been planted. One client had been refused last-minute access to a speaker at a conference and had received a canned apology that smelled of corporate distancing. Another had experienced a change in the account team that felt like an unspoken warning. The new team was full of bright people, but not the kind of people who had once gamely built the client's trust. There were service gaps. There were miscommunications. There were decisions that made sense on a spreadsheet, but destroyed loyalty in human terms. I began to make choices that were small and precise. I offered discounted initial rates to clients who came with me, so they could test the new relationship without financial panic. I introduced them to a network of freelance strategists and production crews I trusted. I focused on creating work that made clients feel seen rather than sold. I sent handwritten notes on the days that mattered. I organized dinners where we did not talk about reports. I listened. It was not without cost. I had to keep my personal life small. I canceled dates because a client called in distress. I lived on a budget that felt ascetic compared to the dinners I had once attended. There was a loneliness to the early days of my company. Friends wanted to know what had happened, and I gave them only the condensed version. I did not want pity. I did not want to appear bruise-hungry. I wanted practical collaboration. The tipping point came slowly, and then all at once. A major client, a boutique luxury retailer called Marlowe, announced that they were exploring a new direction. I had worked with Marlowe for years. They had been with Harrington & Vale since the early 9000s, but their loyalty had been to me. I had once driven to their warehouse at dawn to help salvage a disastrous product shoot. They called me on a Sunday when their flagship window dressing failed before an opening. They laughed about my coffee-stained blazer and called it part of my charm. When I received their call in the early months of Lumen Strategies, they wanted to reimagine an entire campaign. I remember the night I pitched them. The office smelled of lemon oil from the cleaning crew. The city outside glittered. I had used the brand's old visual code but pushed it into something slow and sumptuous. I projected images and told stories about the people who would buy Marlowe in real life. I spoke about the aesthetic of small triumphs. Elena, who still had a presence in some corners, had asked Marlowe for a series of high-profile events and celebrity endorsements. Marlowe wanted something quieter. They wanted a story that made their customers feel like authors of their own style. 3 days after the pitch, a wire transfer landed in our account for the initial retainer. In 1 month, the firm felt the loss. When Marlowe announced they had moved to Lumen Strategies, the industry press wrote a blunted piece about shifts in agency allegiance and mentioned my name in a sentence that tasted like awe. People began to ask why Marlowe had left. Some suggested financial reasons, others hinted at personnel choices. The rumor mill turned my small company into a narrative asset. Elena called me and left a voicemail layered with ice. She asked to meet. I listened to her voicemail twice. I did not call back. That call hardened something in her. I could tell because of the way the firm began to respond. There were counter-proposals, there were last-minute concessions. Elena sent emissaries to clients, people who had always been adept at smoothing worried partners. They made presentations and promised new services and emphasized scale. They offered discounts and bundles. They created new teams and renamed old offerings to feel fresher. It was all theater. It was effective theater for some clients. For others, it felt like the old theater that had run out of truth. I did not want a campaign of sabotage. I wanted quiet business. I wanted to build something durable. But when strategists and account directors and creatives began leaving Harrington and Vale to join Lumen Strategies, the shift became structural. People make companies. When half a dozen trusted creatives you have worked with for years come to you because they believe in a culture of respect, that becomes significant. Some left because they agreed with my critique of the old firm's volatility. Others left because they had been scared by the way the firm had handled my exit. The exodus became a story in itself, and the story accelerated the exodus. One late evening, Elena arrived at a panel discussion about marketing in the digital era. She sat on stage like someone who had prepared for battle. A moderator asked about industry consolidation. She answered with a poised smile and a careful avoidance of specifics. She said the industry was cyclical and that team changes were healthy realignments. The audience nodded. After the event, she was flanked by people who wanted to be in her orbit. Someone recorded a short clip of her talking, and it found a place on a trade website. People began to comment. I read the comments because I am an information addict. I read them not to feed petty delight, but to understand how narratives were shaped. There were moments when my own moral lines blurred. I received an informal offer to take on a former client who had always been on the edge of leaving Harrington and Vale. The offer was attractive, and it would help us with cash flow, but it came with an implied condition. If we accepted the client's business, it would look like a targeted attack. I discussed it with my small team. They argued for action. They felt they deserved victory. I thought about the people at my old firm who had been kind to me. I thought about the colleagues who remained and the interns who had never known why the company had shifted. Ultimately, I made the decision to accept the client because the client needed a different voice and because our approach fit their brand better. I told myself that serving people's needs was the central moral tenet. Once the drip of clients became a steady stream, Harrington and Vale's financials began to creak. The firm had built a structure that assumed a certain client volume and a certain margin. When the largest accounts left, the revenue did not simply shrink. The firm's ability to take risks diminished. They canceled projects. They delayed payments. Vendors began to politely suggest new payment terms. Office morale dropped. Workers who had once felt buoyed by the firm's name now stared at expense reports. Elena tried to salvage the narrative by hosting a series of brand events that were meant to be spectacle and reassurance. She hired a famous event planner and invited industry heavyweights. The party was lavish. It took place in a restored Art Deco theater downtown, and the press attended. Elena gave a speech about resilience and the future. The speech was rapturous to the ears of people who wanted to believe in recovery. Videos of the event circulated. People commented on the food and the music and the costumes. But behind the glitter, there were conversations about cash flow and missed invoices. People who had once been able to eat caviar and call it expense suddenly had to fight for budget approvals. I did not attend those parties. I preferred the everyday work. The calls to clients who were anxious about metrics, the late-night edits to creative copy, the dinners where I listened and synthesized. My life was less glamorous, but it was less performative. I watched the industry press write about the spectacle and then write about the cracks. They framed it as a cautionary tale about hubris and overreach. They used words like recalibration and realignment. They did not use my name in every headline, though my name appeared in the background of several articles. I read them all. The fall was not sudden like a cinematic collapse with glass raining down. It was an attrition. Clients left in stages. One client who had once been the jewel of Harrington and Vale announced a move to a large conglomerate agency that offered scale and bundled services. Another client shifted their account in-house because they wanted direct control. A few legacy accounts remained, tethered to Elena's charisma and the firm's history, but they were fewer and less profitable. Staff attrition continued. The firm publicized restructurings and strategic refocusing. They made noises about innovation. Then the legal troubles began. When a large client realized their campaign reporting had been inaccurate for 2 quarters, they demanded an audit. A vendor, who had not been paid for months, took the firm to arbitration. An employee who had been let go months earlier filed a suit alleging wrongful termination related to a reorganization. These were not disqualifying individually, but together they created a legal and financial fog that made potential clients hesitant. People began to ask whether the firm was a safe harbor. I remember the day I learned that our biggest former client had filed a public statement saying they had been forced to reassess their partnership with Harrington and Vale, and that they were appointing an independent auditor to review past campaigns. The statement did not name me or the firm directly, but the implication was clear. Stockholders in a related holding company began to ask questions. Advertisers became more cautious. In small meetings at my office, we would sometimes laugh, a brittle laugh, at the absurdity of the unfolding events. We were not celebrating pain. We were doing the business of existing in a moment of change. We took on more work and delivered with a precision that felt like reclaiming dignity. We were efficient. We were humane. The city began to notice. People in my industry started to say that something different had arrived. Those words were important because reputation is not only created through clients, but through peers. Elena's responses grew more desperate. She sent legal letters and threatened litigation. She hired crisis PR firms to spin narratives about creative differences. She issued public reassurances that the firm had realigned its mission. Yet every piece of PR was a bandage. People could see through the language. They compared the firm's glossy statements to invoices and to the smell of stale champagne at parties where people now whispered. One day I received a text from an old colleague who remained inside Harrington and Vale. He was a man I had laughed with in the copy room and who had once recommended a documentary that I loved. The text was terse and said, "Meet me for coffee." We met on a Tuesday afternoon at a diner with vinyl booths and too bright lighting. He sat down and looked older, thinner. He told me that the firm had frozen bonuses and was cutting travel budgets. He told me that Elena had held a meeting where she had spoken about the carnage of losing major clients. He used that exact word with a sudden candor that made me feel as if we were discussing a storm's damage. I listened to him and felt a strange mixture of triumph and grief. Triumph because the firm had been challenged and because the vulnerability of an empire is instructive. Grief because real human beings were struggling in ways that were not theatrical. People were losing health insurance. Families were rearranging finances. The cost of my success was not void of consequence. The firm finally declared bankruptcy in a filing that read like a confession of overreach. It cited unsustainable liabilities and losses of critical accounts. Employees were given notices that made the process feel bureaucratic and cold. The building where the firm had once hosted glossy events seemed smaller without the pulse of its parties. Vendors scavenged for what they could. The brand Elena had curated for years was now a case study in business school lectures. I remember sitting alone on the roof of my office building the night the filing became public. The city lay spread beneath me, a lattice of lights. I felt the wind like an instrument against my face. There was a strange realness to the scene. I was not happy in the way people might have imagined. There was no dancing or triumphant shout. There was instead a hollow clarity. I thought about Elena. I thought about the way she had read the list of charges in that conference room. I thought about the way she'd used spectacle to establish control. I also thought about the costume of success and how fragile it can be when decoupled from care. I did not think about the word that some would use to label what I had done. I thought about consequences and about what a person owes to conscience when wielding power. When all was said and done, damage had been done on both sides. Hundreds of people had lost jobs, clients were disrupted. But there was also a rebirth. My company grew into something more structured and less ad hoc. We built a team that valued clarity and mutual respect. We offered positions to people who had been cast off in the firm's collapse. We tried, in our small way, to knit back some of the torn threads of community by offering pro bono work to smaller brands hurt by the market shift. I was present when the former CEO of a client brand called to thank me. She said her team had been concerned about continuity and that our work had given them a sense of consistency. She said the new campaigns had connected with their customers in ways the old ones had not. I felt a warmth in that call that had nothing to do with competition and everything to do with care. There were, of course, accusations. Elena hired lawyers and sent statements to the press. She said that I had engaged in predatory behavior and that I had acted in bad faith. I sat for depositions. I answered questions about when I had begun contacting clients and if I had used proprietary information. My lawyers argued that clients had come to me because of relationships and that I had not bribed anyone. The legal process was tedious and sometimes humiliating. The press loved the spectacle and used it for headlines that created patterns of false equivalence. When the dust settled, there were settlements and non-disclosure agreements. I paid sums I wish I did not have to pay. Elena received a public apology from one of the magazine pieces that had once celebrated her. She received offers of consulting work because the world is always willing to buy expertise. She kept some friends and lost others. She spoke at a conference on leadership months later. She spoke with a voice that was steady, resolute, and to me, oddly teachable. She described the experience of losing what one thought was unassailable, and she seemed, in that moment, human in a way that had been obscured by power. I do not pretend that what I did was purely righteous. I would not have preferred the firm to collapse. I would not have said I enjoyed the suffering that happened to people who had been my colleagues. I felt guilt. I felt remorse. I also felt a fierce sense of justice for all the small humiliations stacked against me in that conference room. The moral ledger of the world is not always organized into neat columns. Life is messy and human hearts harbor contradictions. Still, when everything quieted, there was one moment I keep replaying in my head. It was weeks after the bankruptcy when Elena walked into a small gallery in Venice where I had organized an intimate showcase for a brand launch. She was there not as a guest, but because someone had extended a private invitation. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room. I watched her from across the gallery. She did not approach me. She did not speak to me. I had imagined many conversations in my head, a confrontation, a catharsis, a reconciliation. None of those happened. Instead, she looked at the art on the walls, like a woman cataloging the world to find purchase. Her face had tired lines. Her posture was still impeccable. For a moment we shared a look that was not friendly, but not entirely hostile either. It felt like the brief crossing of two ships passing in the dark. I saw in her eyes, not villainy, but a complicated sorrow. She left without a word. I felt something akin to pity, and then a recognition that both of us had traded pieces of ourselves in the exchange. I have been asked whether I regret how things ended. I have been asked whether it was worth it. I do not have a simple answer because values are not currency. In many nights when the city is awake and I cannot sleep, I think about the times I chose silence over confrontation and the times I chose strategy over confession. I think about the cost of dignity and the price of being seen. There was one final act that felt for me like the closing chord. The firm had a bronze plaque in the lobby with the names of founding partners and the dates they had started. It was a small thing, shiny and meant to feel permanent. One evening, a week after the bankruptcy filing, I happened to be across the street when a moving truck left the building. In the fading light, the plaque caught the sun like an eye. I watched as workers took down framed photographs and wrapped them in bubble wrap. A man carrying a box paused and looked back at the plaque. He ran his hand across the metal as if checking memory. I thought about the plaque and how institutions make claims to permanence. I thought about how human lives fold in and out of those claims. I imagined, absurdly, that the plaque would someday be a footnote in a case study. I imagined that someone in a different city would one day teach a class using our story as cautionary material. In a strange way, the thought made me feel less alone. When I open my eyes in the morning, I still think about construction of a life that is worthy and the way people in power can choose to build in ways that protect or ways that crush. I have made a career out of storytelling, of convincing people that their businesses have meaning. I used that skill to create a company that tries to do the same without using spectacle as a weapon. If there is a lesson I would offer, it is not simple. It is not a moralistic phrase, it is a messy truth about human choices. Power can be wielded carefully or badly. Loyalty can be nurtured or traded. People are fragile when they are humiliated in public. There are costs to humiliation that ripple outward. The last line of this chapter in my life is not neat. The firm that had fired me no longer exists in the way it once had. Some people blame me, others do not. I was at the center of a storm, and my name will likely be attached to versions of this story for years. I accept that as consequence. I do not take pleasure in the sufferings of others. I do not delight in scenes of collapse. I do, however, take responsibility for the way I chose to respond. I remember the exact moment the company finally folded. It was rainy that day, and the city smelled like wet concrete and cut grass. I walked past a newsstand where a headline declared the bankruptcy. Someone tapped my shoulder and said congratulations with a grin that was a little too wide. I smiled politely and kept walking. Later that night, I sat at my desk and wrote an email to my team. I told them I was proud and that we would keep building things that mattered. I told them that dignity was a practice, not a promised state. I told them to sleep and to not watch the news if it made them sick. I poured myself a glass of red wine and sat on the window ledge and watched the city breathe. At some point, I found myself thinking of a line from a poem I had loved in college. It went something like this: "The river does not ask permission to carry leaves away." I thought about that image and how it felt apt. People and companies are like leaves on a river. Sometimes they set afloat deliberately. Sometimes they are torn away by force. The river keeps moving. If there is a payoff to the story, it is not that I enjoyed seeing a rival fall. That would be a cheap triumph. The payoff is that I reclaimed an agency that had been taken from me and used it to build something that felt like sustenance for the people who had stuck with me. The payoff is that I learned the limits of spectacle and the value of small acts of care. The payoff is the honest work we did and the way clients said, months later, that they felt seen. I do not know what waits in the next chapter. I only know that I will be deliberate in how I use my power because I remember the way it felt to be dismissed publicly. I remember the sound of Elena's voice cataloging my failures. I remember being shoved out and the taste of lemon coffee and the hum of the fluorescent lights. I remember the box and the succulent and the photograph of my mother. I remember the feeling of walking back into the world with nothing but a small bag of resilience and a willingness to listen. The end of the old firm was a sharp, cold lesson delivered in full view. It left wreckage and also possibility. If there is cruelty in the world, there is also a strange economy of restitution. The clients who followed me did not do so out of spite, but because they wanted service that honored their work. That choice mattered more than any headline. When the story is told years from now, people will remember the spectacle. They will quote lines and make bullet points. They will forget small things like the smell of lemon oil or the weight of a cardboard box. I will remember the sound of the rooftop wind that night, and how it felt like a voice telling me that fortunes can be remade by hands that are willing to do the small, honest work. I will remember, with a precise cruelty that matches the business world, that power without care breaks. The city will continue to move, and the river will carry leaves away. I will keep walking, carrying with me what I learned.